Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Toxic Masculinity, What They Don't Tell You in Therapy. While approaching America by ship in 1909, Freud took exception to Jung's remark that they were bringing enlightenment to the New World. No, said Freud, their ship was delivering the plague. Scott McClemmy. Many patients want to be excused for their current predicament because of events that occurred in their childhood. That's what psychiatry has become in America. Visit any shopping mall or ethnic pride parade and witness the results. Dr. Krakower, The Sopranos. Hi everybody, or should I say bada bing. This is, for those of you who don't recognise it, Tony Soprano from the Soprano TV series that went, I think, from 1999 to 2007. And don't worry if you've never seen it, because I'm just going to refer to very specific instances, and I'm going to provide the dialogue that I'm going to be referring to. And I'm using material from The Sopranos just as illustrative examples, just to make practical what otherwise might just get lost as, airy-fairy theoretical ramblings. So I just have... It's got to be in my top 3 of all time TV shows, The Sopranos. I'm thinking of other shows like Mad Men, Breaking Bad, those type of shows. I think for someone who spends a lot of their time making fun of or critiquing mass culture, I also think you have to be fair and say when it almost reaches a brilliant art form. I just think the Sopranos series and the other 2 I mentioned are that good that you've got to give them credit. Not all mass culture is abysmal, that's for sure. And he encapsulates, because the topic I want to talk about is the notion of toxic masculinity, and the Sopranos and this character, the protagonist Tony Soprano in particular, and his relationship to the females in his life, his wife Carmela, his sister Janice, and his mother Livia. They're the issues I'm going to pick up on, but I think it raises really topical issues today about a topic I introduced in the previous video about how men handle anger, and how in the virally popular TV series Adolescence on Netflix, anger and how men express it, the implicit ideology of that series seemed to be men shouldn't be angry, men shouldn't express it. And that doesn't strike me as a particularly feasible way of going about things. Men do get angry, men are filled with testosterone. How do you manage it as a society? And Tony Soprano, as you can see, is this ursine, sometimes affable, sometimes not figure. So ursine as in bear-like. And he's just a big bear of a man. He can be a charming father and husband, and equally he can be a sociopathic killer. And that ambivalence is explored throughout the series to brilliant effect. And I want to share with you this character. I quoted him as one of the first 2 epigraphs, but Dr. Krakower, who is he is involved in, and I'm going to look at it specifically, he's involved in a piece of dialogue with Tony's wife Carmela that is potentially my all-time favourite piece of dialogue. I've got 2 all-time favourites, both from The Sopranos. One is funny, and this I found funny because I just have a very dark sense of humour, but his dialogue with Carmela is also quite, I don't know whether poignant's the right word, but it goes to the heart of what the series is about and the type of choices Carmela makes in her life, and arguably her refusal to take responsibility for them. And the whole theme of therapy in this talk, it's a notion that runs all the way through The Sopranos, because Tony has panic attacks and he goes to see a therapist, Jennifer Melfi, I think it is, and I don't think, I think he keeps it obviously a secret from his peers as much as he possibly can, because it doesn't go down too well in the mafia to be having to go to see a therapist. And Tony himself is incredibly ambivalent, because as we'll shortly see, he's a man's man, and he bemoans the fact that everything has to be dysfunctional in society and everyone has to be moaning about everything. He basically says what's happened to the quiet, strong types. You know, that's what's wrong with America. But he himself has panic attacks, and he's trying to, that's why he's driven to go. He has an awful relationship with his mother. His relationship with his wife's not great. The kids, and so on and so on. And that goes to the theme of, in the most affluent country on earth, America, and to a lesser extent what I call the 51st state, Britain, we have this problem of affluenza. A lot of our psychological problems are only due to the fact we are so fortunate in a material sense. Most people trying to scrabble an existence around the world do not have time for the type of psychological complaints we do. And this character, Dr. Krakower, he says what normally isn't said. And that's a theme I'll pick up at the end with reference to a Colonel Jessup character from the film A Few Good Men, played by Jack Nicholson, which I don't think is a particularly brilliant film, but there's a particular piece of dialogue at the very end in a military courtroom. That scene is absolutely brilliant. And like, in a different way, but like Dr. Krakower, the Jack Nicholson character says what isn't normally said. But in the dialogue I'll share with you later, this Dr. Krakower, he represents, he just looks like a perfect stand-in for Freud. But he is completely direct, to the point that I'm also going to show you comments other people have made critiquing him and standing up for Carmela and her point of view. And I find that fascinating, because I could not be more on Dr. Krakower's side if I went to the University of being on Dr. Krakower's side and got an emeritus professorship in being on Dr. Krakower's side. I could not be less on Carmela Soprano's side, and I'll develop this theme as we go along. But then when it comes to people like this Colonel Jessup, the Jack Nicholson character in A Few Good Men, or Tony Soprano, the masculinity they exhibit, what I wanted to ask you to think about is, I'm not defending them particularly because I think they're incredibly flawed characters. But by the same token, are they purely and absolutely wrong? Or is there a scintilla of truth to what they're saying? And then this Dr. Krakower character is another angle as well, because he's critiquing alpha male behaviour and psychotic sociopathic male behaviour, but he's also criticised by some for being too honest and direct. So this just points to the absolute difficulty, without sounding like a whiny man, which is what I'm critiquing everyone has to be going into therapy. But I'm just trying to point out in all the various ways in which, not that being a man is difficult, but in the current climate, what is expected of men. Because the Tony Soprano alpha male is wrong. This type of direct speaking, anti-alpha male figure is wrong. What is this tiny little path that is acceptable masculinity in our society? And I just think the film A Few Good Men and the TV series Sopranos just provide two really striking examples of this tension, this issue that surrounds us about masculinity, and in particular toxic masculinity. And as I've begun to introduce in the last couple of videos, this is a key figure I'm going to do more work on as we go along. And I've mentioned previously, he did a posthumously published trilogy called collectively Sacred Order, Social Order. And he didn't actually publish that much during his lifetime. There's various bits and bobs. I think he did The Feeling Intellect was a collection of his work. Fellow Teachers was one of his works. He did a book about Freud, the moralist. I should have made notes on this, apologies, but I'm just giving you an indication. He was basically, his main interest was in Freud and therapeutic culture. And from that, he derived a series of concepts. So his key ideas, an idea I've introduced previously, is the three worlds. So in Rieff's schema, the first world relates to things like tribal societies and ancient Greece, where the dominant mode of interpreting and understanding the world was the form of myth. So capricious gods, taboos, and so on. The second world is the world of the major world religions and faith. You have faith in a transcendent being. And on the basis of that, nearly all the world religions, well, the ones I know particularly, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they all have what Rieff refers to as interdictions, or another way of putting that is thou shalt not. And the third world is the world in which we currently live, in which those interdictions, thou shalt not, have largely been replaced by thou shalt, thy shall fill thy boots and do whatever you want in whatever hedonistic extreme activities you decide you want to do, and no one can tell you off because you're the sole arbiter of your own behaviour and life choices. Without sounding like an Old Testament prophet. And what he describes, as I mentioned, he was fascinated with Freud, but in an interesting way, because often Freud, I'd suggest, is misrepresented as being very indulgent, when there's a line of thought that he is much more like Dr. Krakower and quite judgmental. But it can't be denied that Freud, whether he meant it or not, his developments in psychoanalysis helped herald the culture we're now in, that Rieff referred to as a therapeutic culture. This notion that we go running off to therapy every time we have any slight concern or psychological problem. And I've got to be careful, because I don't mean to denigrate therapy. It will sound like I am, so I apologise in advance. But it's a more general thing about why people need therapy perhaps more than they ever have. And it relates to Rieff's idea of moving from a second to third world. In the second world, therapy is a bit redundant, because you have priests, you have rabbis, you have imams, you have gurus, you have a much stronger community, much more strong extended families that have strong family bonds and tribal bonds. So you don't need to go to a stranger for advice. You're probably getting advice from all around you more than you need. So therapeutic culture, as Rieff understands it or uses the notion, is inextricably linked with the idea that we've lost the strong bonds that exist in the second world. And one aspect of this is the concept of charisma. And we have a modern understanding of charisma that tends to be associated with politicians or actors. And Rieff would argue this is a hollowed out understanding of charisma. The charisma he's talking about is the type of charisma Old Testament, I've mentioned them, but Old Testament prophets had, a religious figure like Jesus would have had. And the charisma derives from our relationship to the notion of a transcendent being. The prophet or the religious leader is a representative of what Rieff calls his holy terror. We're in fear of this transcendent being. And once you get rid of that, the only people that can really be fearful of are ourselves. And one of the arguments he develops, which I'll look at, I've briefly mentioned in a previous video, but I'll delve into this in more depth, is the concept that we become monsters because we become the sole arbiters of our own moral choices, and we lose this ability to project onto a transcendent being. There are loads of implications, a lot of them negative, that Rieff traces from this movement from the second to the third world. And charisma is one. He's suggesting genuine, profound charisma has been replaced by the snake oil salesman type of charisma that you find in actors and politicians. And then finally, he has this notion of death works, which is his way of describing artworks and how they're reduced to blasphemy, in the most extreme case, blasphemy. So there have been various, in recent times, artworks that have deliberately been quite provocatively sacrilegious. If not sacrilegious, then kitsch, or the extreme ends of modern art, completely non-figurative. I can think of some modern paintings that involved elephant dung, the use of human excrement, all these type of extreme forms of art he referred to as death works, and I would include in that, I refer you back to the video I did on adolescence. Adolescence, to me, the Netflix series, is a death work because it's completely absent of any overarching explanation for society's problems. There's no authority in the series. It's all about an emptied out society. Another example would be the series Euphoria, about young kids taking drugs, underage sex, and they just lead this hedonistic, ultimately incredibly depressing life, zonked off their heads most of the time on hard drugs. And it's presented partially as somehow liberating and they're free, but on the other hand, as we'll see as we go along, having lost touch with the second world also threatens the disintegration of the human psyche. We need the stability of social structures, this idea in the second phrase at the top, the social order. So in Rieff's world, the sacred order and the social order are inextricably linked together. And that's a clear example, just a little pithy quote there: where there is nothing sacred, there is nothing. And then I think at this point he was riffing on a sentence from James Joyce's Ulysses, if I'm remembered correctly. So that explains why this is deliberately confusing syntax. Wherever we may be in the whatness of our who-ness, what we are is constituted by where we are in the sacred order. So I hope that makes sense. But I think, like I say, apologies if I've misremembered, but I think at this point he's talking about James Joyce's Ulysses, which is the syntax in that, as in a lot of James Joyce's work, is incredibly confusing. And Rieff would argue that is it symbolises or encapsulates when Joyce was writing in the 1920s, how modernity was going through this. It had already either got there or it was entering the third world when traditional religious values, etc., no longer held sway. And I just think it's quite a powerful argument that whatever the rights and wrongs of whatever religion, to think, and Nietzsche identified this in the late 1800s, but to think that you could do without the death of God. And even I think Richard Dawkins recently, probably the world's most famous atheist, has said that he's a cultural Christian, meaning almost explicitly what you need, I think Dawkins is saying, like Rieff is saying, is even if you don't happen to be religious, you need some of these concepts to help structure your society. Otherwise it becomes a dangerous free-for-all. And another way of putting that is this, this refers to Alistair MacIntyre. And I'm trying to... After Virtue is the book being referred to, and I think that was 1981. And I'll read it and then explain a bit more. MacIntyre argued that without a narrative context, the individual storytelling animal is dislocated and disoriented. In After Virtue, MacIntyre elaborated, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. And I picked out this quote because it just goes directly to this channel's main theme, that without art, so when Rieff talks about sacred order, if not actual religion, then the stories that Western Christianity gave us and Judaism, the stories that we were given that help structure our society, help orientate us. And in a post-literate world and a post-religious world, the effect is quite profound. As I keep saying, you don't have to be particularly religious to benefit from, like Richard Dawkins, this notion of cultural Christianity, this undergirding of a society from the Old and New Testament that gave rise to an awful lot of underlying notions and values in our society. And Alistair MacIntyre's a fascinating philosopher, because he argues that basically with the Enlightenment and the turn to science, we lost what's technically called a teleological approach to ethics, and he's a massive fan of Aristotle. And I won't bore you with the full details, maybe another time, which you can look forward to being bored by Aristotle. But the teleology is the idea of an end, the being an end purpose. So Aristotle wasn't religious in a Western Christian sense, but he had this notion of there was a purpose to being a human being. We were storytelling animals, we're political animals. Aristotle developed the whole Nicomachean ethics, this practical ethics about how to approach life that had behind it presuppositions about what the end and what the ultimate point of being a human being was. And MacIntyre's suggesting it's heavily suggested in the title, After Virtue, when concepts like virtue that the ancient Romans and Greeks were very familiar with, when they disappear, they almost sound quaint, don't they, to be virtuous. The Stoics and other philosophers are very strong on these ideas of how to develop individual virtue. And MacIntyre's suggesting that that's largely gone. And a bit like Rieff, that's why I've linked the two quotes, this leads to psychological disintegration. Who we are is rendered intelligible by the narratives that form us. Even if one chooses to rebel against the normative direction and embedded ends of the traditions and communities that have shaped this story. And I want to give you a very specific example of this. There's Tony Soprano and one of his henchmen, Bobby, I think Cacciarelli, and they're in a diner. And I must admit, I have a fetish about American diners, and they're absolutely amazing. And they're sat at the counter, and they just have this, I just think it summarizes, and in the previous, if I can go back to, I've italicized and emboldened there, even if one chooses to rebel against the normative direction and embedded ends of the traditions and communities that have shaped the story. Why I'm showing you the next bit of dialogue is that it's a very funny example of you don't even have to rebel against. The problem is in our society, the absolute heraldic levels of ignorance about our own cultural stories. So I alluded to this, well, I didn't allude to it, I dealt with it directly in the video I did about the Paris Olympics and the Papa Smurf stroke Dionysus figure, and the way in which people didn't understand the reference, and the person who chose to use the reference didn't understand the reference because he used Dionysus or Papa Smurf figure as representative of brotherly love and peace. Dionysus was the god of frenzied, bacchanalian, murderous success. But anyway, what I just want to emphasize here is this idea of rebelling against. You don't even have to do that. It's got worse in our society, because if you're profoundly ignorant about our own cultural stories, then you don't need to rebel. You'll see what happens in the following funny example. So this is Bobby talking to Tony Soprano, remember, in a diner. Mom started going downhill after the World Trade Center. You know, Quasimodo predicted all this. Who did what? All these problems, the Middle East, the end of the world. Nostradamus. Quasimodo's the hunchback of Notre Dame. I've got to get through this without absolutely bricking myself laughing. Oh, right. Nostradamus. Nostradamus and Notre Dame. Two different things completely. It's interesting, though. They'd be so similar, isn't it? And I always thought, okay, hunchback of Notre Dame. You've also got your quarterback and halfback of Notre Dame. One's a fucking cathedral. Obviously, I know. I'm just saying. It's interesting. He's not laughing in the actual program. Sorry. The coincidence. What? You're going to tell me you've never pondered that? The back thing with Notre Dame? No. Well, apologies for my lousy... Well, I didn't even try and do an American accent, did I? Because I know American viewers would get annoyed with me. But from that same article, but the point is that one does not create his or her own narrative ab initio. Self-identity is in large part shaped by the inheritances, traditions and cultures of others. Family, community, civilization. And that's another reason I find the Tony Soprano character interesting, because as the name implies, he's from an Italian mafioso family. And at one part of the series, he goes back to Italy. And that's funny, because although he's American-Italian, the distance between him and the actual Italians is quite profound. They may as well be from different planets, although they share the same heritage. And that's quite funny sometimes to see the culture clash. But Tony Soprano is caught between these things. On the one hand, he's a disintegrating psyche, and on the other hand, he's the last remnant of this type of loyalty to your clan in terms of the mafioso, but also in terms of his Italian heritage. But then you've got this added psychological dynamic. So the way in which, I think, was it Philip Larkin, the poet, said that parents, they fuck you up. I think I'm paraphrasing quite accurately in one of his poems. But this is his mother, Livia. And I think it's deliberate. Livia was the first empress. She was the wife of Emperor Augustus. And I think she was the great-great-grandmother, I think she was the great-grandmother of Caligula. I hope I've got that right. And I think the writers of The Sopranos were clever enough. It's just too much of a coincidence that they called her Livia, because Empress Livia in the 1st century AD was one of the most dangerous and scheming matriarchs in Roman history. And this seemingly helpless old lady is an horrendous influence on Tony's life. And it also interests me that such an ursine, powerful man, at a certain level, is still a tiny little boy when he has to deal with his mother, which is just one of those eternal human truths. But Livia is this is a great photo, because she's absolutely brilliant at portraying herself as a defenseless old lady who everyone's picking on. Meanwhile, she's plotting the deaths of close family members at the drop of a hat. She truly is one of my favourite old age pensioner psychopaths in any art form I can think of. And I like this particular quote because it reminds me of Nietzsche's idea of the last man. It's good to be in something from the ground floor. I came too late for that, and I know. But lately, I'm getting the feeling that I came in at the end. The best is over. And I just think that's quite poignant, but it goes to this notion of travelling from the second to the third world in Rieff's terms. That there was a time when family, community, and all these things were incredibly strong. but Tony feels like he's come in at the end of even the mafia. The mafia is in its end days. And then in this quote, we tend to think of Freud's work as a negation of moralism, an attempt to liberate the individual from the excessive demands of the social order. And I think that's something Olivia says at one point. Always with the demands. From the sorry, I'm heckling myself now. From the excessive demands of the social order. But his view of the world was a far cry from that of the therapeutic culture that took shape in his wake. He was sceptical about how much insight most patients could ever achieve, let alone the benefits following from the effort. The mass of humanity, Freud said, was riffraff. The best the analyst could hope for was to cure the client of enough neurotic misery to be able to deal with ordinary human unhappiness. And I'm sorry, this probably explains why I've never been to therapy, because this is the type of thing I find, this dark description of Freud's insight. I have this knee-jerk inability not to laugh, because I just think Freud is so misunderstood. And as has been pointed out in one of the previous quotes, his psychoanalytical outlook led to the therapeutic culture where everyone's treated like a child, whereas he had much more limited aims. And it could only be the life perspective of a European Jew at the time that Freud was writing. Just this idea, the idea he wanted to cure the client of enough neurotic misery to be able to deal with ordinary human unhappiness. So I'm laughing, and shame on me. But the idea of the difference, I think this is a key distinction, the difference in neurotic misery and ordinary human unhappiness. And I think that distinction is neurotic misery is the unhappiness we cause ourselves by repeating the same mistakes, this neurosis, this inability to learn, this repetition, this compulsion, whereas normal, ordinary human happiness is just trying to deal with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. To quote Shakespeare, life throws up enough crap at us all the time without adding to it by engaging in this neurotic behaviour. And that's arguably what Freud's purpose was to help us not repeat the things we do have some control over, so that we can just get on with all the other horrible stuff that we can't control. Excuse me. And talking about neurotic misery, this is one of my... Well, I've got so many favourite characters, it's a meaningless term in The Sopranos. But this is Tony's sister, Janice, who is the absolute embodiment of therapeutic culture. So Tony goes to therapy and he's ambivalent. He's partially conflicted. He wants to be the strong, silent type, but also he wants to get rid of these horrible panic attacks. And at one point he says to his Jennifer Melfi, his therapist, mentioning Freud actually, he says, I understand Freud. I've done a semester and a half of college, because he didn't finish college. But it's brilliant the way his semester and a half makes him an expert on Freud. But anyway, Janice is much less conflicted about being in therapy. She's like a poster child for a type of Californian, wacky, way out there, woohoo. I'm using technical terms now, I hope you appreciate. But just this, self-indulgent therapeutic mentality is Janice in absolute spades. And she only appears in one episode, I think, but this is Janice's therapist. I think her name was Sandy Shaw. And I think any real fans of The Sopranos, this will be one of their favourite quotes. But she's advising her Ralphie is the current boyfriend of Janice, and boy does she go through boyfriends. So they're talking about Ralphie, and it's interesting that Ralphie is one of the mafia. And Janice has this talk about this point about neurotic, compulsive, repetitious behaviour. Janice keeps going out with members of the mafia and close associates of her brother, and it always ends badly, and she always keeps doing it. So Ralphie's just the latest in a chain of these men. And this is what the therapist says. You've got to sit down. You've got to sit him down and level with him. Speak the truth, Jan, but with the compassion and respect that you're famous for. Which you have to be familiar with the series to realise this is the diametric 180-degree opposite of the truth. But the point is, they're mutual enablers. Janice enables this therapist to think that she's helping people and she's a good therapist. And this therapist, Sandy Shaw, enables Janice to think wonderfully about herself, even though she's an absolute car crash of a human being in lots of ways. So another article, outside the play of televisual signifiers, there are people, and that's televisual signifiers just means in the play of TV environment, there are, or TV depictions, there are people who, in one crucial area or other of their lives, never learn a damned thing. Or if they do, it still makes no difference, because they make the same mistakes each time a fresh opportunity presents itself. And I think that really is true of Janice. This is perhaps the essence of Freud's distinction between neurotic misery and normal unhappiness. And I just think that's why I appreciate it's only a TV series, but this is what I'm suggesting all the time on this channel, that good art does, good literature, and in this case, brilliant television. It's able to encapsulate and embody human processes that when you talk about them abstractly, even in therapy speak, it's just verbiage. Whereas when you can provide practical examples of people's behaviour, it's so much more powerful. And I think that's just what The Sopranos does absolutely exceptionally. But back to Tony. So he says, I find I have to be the sad clown, laughing on the outside, crying on the inside. And then more profoundly, Nathaniel Hawthorne. No man can wear one face to himself and another to the multitude without finally getting bewildered as to which one may be true. And in that sense, I'd argue Tony Soprano's an everyman for... And in some ways, the Soprano TV series coincided with the rise of the World Wide Web and the internet. But obviously since then, and this is how quickly the pace of change goes, you know, the last episode aired in 2007. We're only in 2025, and it just seems a different world ago. But what they're talking about with or what I'm contrasting the Nathaniel Hawthorne and Soprano, I'm linking them, these two quotes. This is what Tony Soprano suffers from. The lack of authenticity, and what I'm arguing is that this clash between what you feel inside and how you have to present yourself, it's only got exponentially worse with the advent of social media. And this is a great quote from Tony. I think I can call him Tony now, we're quite close. Let me tell you something. Nowadays, everybody's got to go to shrinks and counsellors and go on Sally Jessy Raphael, which was a TV daytime programme, and talk about their problems. What happened to Gary Cooper, the strong, silent type? That was an American. He was in touch with his feelings. He just did what he had to do. See, what they didn't know was once they got Gary Cooper in touch with his feelings, they wouldn't be able to shut him up. And then it's dysfunction this, and dysfunction that, and dysfunction vaffanculo, which is a very rude word in Italian, by the way, which a bolderized version would be go and fiddle with yourself. And there's a suitably dramatic shot of Gary Cooper, who did what a man had to do. So that's one quite important theme. Tony Soprano, albeit admittedly being this burr-like, sociopathic, sometimes nice, sometimes murderous alpha male character. So in that sense, it's easy to maybe be a bit sneering about his view of someone like Gary Cooper. But there is a bigger picture that is a main theme of The Sopranos. What do you do with alpha males? And what role, if any, do they have? And one particularly interesting role that'll segue into, I'm going to now start talking about Tony Soprano's wife. But one subplot in The Sopranos was Dr. Melfi, Tony Soprano's therapist, gets physically and sexually assaulted in a underground parking lot. And the subplot is that her highly educated middle-class professional husband tries to be the empathetic, understanding husband. And Dr. Melfi, this person highly trained in therapeutic and psychoanalytical insight, has this she controls it, but she has periods of this murderous desire for this attacker to be punished. And it's interesting because the writers of the program explore quite directly how such an urbane and a woman who's devoted her life to the civilized discussion of everything has these murderous impulses because she's been on the receiving end of male violence. But there's the strong sense that she actually says to her husband in a half serious way, one of the things that makes her feel better is she knows she could have this guy. I think she uses a phrase like, I could have him squashed like a bug, meaning she could get Tony or someone like him because they find out who the attacker was. And she's almost tempted to wreak revenge on this man using another man's violence. And this is in our society, that type of, the men cause the problems, but they can be a bulwark against dangerous evil men. You need good men prepared to be violent. This is the whole Gary Cooper thing. What happens in a society where the odds and the game are stacked all in favour of the psychopathic evil men, because we've decided that any type of violence from any type of men is bad. That opens up potentially a huge can of worms. It leaves often women vulnerable. And that, in this very strong character of Dr. Melfi, that idea is explored quite brilliantly, the way they do it. But going on to Tony's wife, Carmela, who's a brilliant character as well. She goes to see Dr. Krakower, and he really tells it the way he thinks it is. And what makes it such a powerful excerpt, and I've put the link to the video in the description, is that Carmela is obviously A, not expecting this from a therapist, and B, to be fair to Carmela, therapists don't normally say the things that this particular therapist says. And I thought it would be interesting to think about, why is this character so rare? Is it because he's completely wrong? Or is it because he's saying the unsayable? And if that the second is true, if he's saying the unsayable but he's actually right, what are the social pressures and social mores that stop his type of honesty being more common? So this is the episode. So you've gone into, you're a good way into season 3. So it's more powerful if you're familiar with the series, because you've seen the type of moral negotiations Carmela makes with her own conscience. She likes the very nice house, the wealth that comes with having a mafioso husband, and yet he's got, I think it's the phrase Gumar, he's got the women on the side. He's a serial philanderer behind her back and doesn't even hide it very well. So there's the constant embarrassment and humiliation. So she constantly is wrestling with why I'm with this man. But it's only a half-hearted wrestle because she likes all the good things that come with it. So when she's on the receiving end, excuse me, when she's on the receiving end of this quite blunt advice, this is the dialogue that goes on. I thought psychiatrists weren't supposed to be judgmental. And this is what I quoted earlier. Many patients want to be excused for their current predicament because of events that occurred in their childhood. That's what psychiatry has become in America. Visit any shopping mall or ethnic pride parade and witness the results. He's a good man. He's a good father. You tell me he's a depressed criminal, prone to anger, serially unfaithful. Is that your definition of a good man? You must trust your initial impulse and consider leaving him. You'll never be able to feel good about yourself. You'll never be able to quell the feelings of guilt and shame that you talked about, so long as you're his accomplice. You're wrong about the accomplice part, though. You sure? All I did was make sure he's got clean clothes in his closet and dinner on his table. So enable would be a more accurate job description for what you do than accomplice. My apologies. Take only the children, what's left of them, and go. My priest said I should work with him, help him to become a better man. How's that going? And I love that bit because the priest character is a wishy-washy post-Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, trendy, probably a liberation theologist. And it's just quite a humorous contrast. He's the trendy Catholic priest, and the Jewish therapist is much more morally strict. It's almost like this difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Have you ever read Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky? And Sir Carmela shakes her head. It's not an easy read. That's an understatement. It's about guilt and redemption. I think your husband ought to turn himself in and read this book in his jail cell and meditate on his crimes every day for 7 years so that he might be redeemed. I think I was just born in the wrong era. I'd love to be an Old Testament prophet. I would have to get a lawyer, find an apartment, arrange for child support. So she just starts making up excuses. You're not listening. I'm not charging you because I won't take blood money, and you can't either. One thing you can never say is that you haven't been told. I see. And in those 2 words, no human being has not seen to the extent that myopic Carmela has not seen what she's just been told. But if I was ever going to get a tattoo, which I never ever will, but it would be, one thing you can never say is that you haven't been told. It's an absolutely brilliant quote, because that is, he's taken away her last alibi that people like the trendy priest provided her with. And then this is, I thought it would be interesting. I don't mean to pick on CZ here, who's just someone who wrote, I think in her self-description, she's someone who writes about TV and dogs, so I've got some empathy with her immediately. But I'm using her analysis of that conversation I've just shown you because it's just a brilliant summary of what I absolutely reject. If you tied me to the stake and started burning me, I would not agree with what you're about to read. It couldn't be further away from what I honestly think is an accurate assessment of that conversation. But I get the sense I'm prejudicing your interpretation of what's to follow. This scene remains brilliant. It's tense and dramatic. But upon rewatching this episode in 2016, what gets me is that Dr. Krakower's proclamations and judgments are so ineffective. Yes, he proposes a simple black and white analysis of Carmela's situation, but what does he know of her life? He's acting like a priest or professor on high. He's judging without bothering to even try to walk a mile in her shoes. Yes, this idea, he proposes a simple black and white analysis. So CZ here seems to be assuming that sometimes life is simple. It doesn't always have to be complicated. I do understand from a therapeutic perspective, the more complicated you can make life, the more money you can make from your patients. But it was interesting that Dr. Krakower refuses to take any money because he identifies very quickly that's what all this is about. That's why Carmela stays with him. So, sorry CZ, it is incredibly black and white. A woman is married to a murdering sociopath because she likes the lifestyle. So CZ goes on to refuse. You can tell what riles her is that he's acting like a priest or professor on high. And I just love that phrase, on high. It's very revealing, inadvertently revealing. And interestingly, Philip Rieff has this concept he calls it via, which is a pun on the idea of the Latin for road. But via is an acronym he uses for vertical in authority. And what he suggests is we've lost any sense of verticality in our society. So in the Adolescent Netflix series, it's a horizontal world. There's no authority being referred to. There's no religion. There's no hierarchical explanation for why the boy Jamie has done what he's done. Everything's very confusing and largely meaningless. But he's acting like a priest or professor on high. Yes, he's making a moral judgment as a therapist. And ZZ, there are lots of articles I could find you online like this, where the implicit assumption that CZ and others are making is a therapist shouldn't be judgmental. And this goes to Philip Rieff's ideas about interdiction. It's very interesting how subtly therapy becomes an excuse for, like Janice and Sandy Shaw. You want validation for whatever you decide you're going to do. And you'll tend to pick the type of therapist you already suspect will give you the answers you want to hear. And the Lord knows, various formal religions have their problems. But what I did like about, not that I can remember, but I'd like to have lived in Second Vatican Council times, or preferably in Old Testament times. But, boy, they were not afraid of giving judgment. And you don't know, the chance of going to a priest for advice, the odds are you would get very stern advice. But now, advice isn't really advice. Therapy is largely either condoning or making you feel more comfortable with the choices you've made. The idea of questioning or judging someone. This idea that he's judging without bothering to even try to walk a mile in her shoes. It's one of the most cliched things, you know, you need to walk a mile in my shoes. No, I don't. This idea that you have to empathise to the nth degree to make a judgment about someone's behaviour. Yeah, everyone's got different influences. Everyone's got different psychological backgrounds. What formed them? But the idea that we should just endlessly make excuses and allowances for people because you haven't had my lived experience. That's why you hear the phrase lived experience all the time. I'm riling myself up now. I'm going to start the anti-lived experience political party. He's not connecting with her, and that makes me feel for her. What's that got to do with anything? I went all scouse there. Yeah, I'll start talking at such a high pitch that dolphins start beaching themselves. But he's not connecting with her, and that makes me feel for her. Again, implicit is this the value judgment that CZ's making is against judgment, but she's strongly making the judgment that it's his job to connect with her, rather than it's his job to take an objective point of view and try and give the best advice he can, whether that's comfortable advice or not. And that makes me feel for her. Yeah, it makes me feel angry that she doesn't listen to the advice she's being given. So I don't think CZ and I are going to agree on this one. But we'll continue. Perhaps she seems so much more sympathetic in retrospect when viewing this scene, because I know what happens in the final several seasons. She comes to the brink of leaving Tony, but she retreats, partly out of love, but mostly out of pragmatism. Nearly all out of pragmatism, CZ. She has been outmaneuvered. He taints the pool of divorce attorneys in the area by meeting there's always one word, but I absolutely struggle. Preliminarily. Hey, I did it. With several of them. She calculates the cost of leaving him financially and emotionally, but mostly financially. And finally decided against it. Yeah, it wasn't much of a decision. She extorts out of him a down payment for a spec house, a construction project that ultimately proves profitable. And CZ seems to be mentioning this as if that's ultimate justification. She gets the spec house of her dreams, and she makes a profit on it. So she was right all along. The idea that she shouldn't take blood money has obviously passed CZ by. She's a realist to some extent. She realises that she's responsible, that she has made choices that have led to where she is, and she deals with it as best she can. She's not so hard to identify with in the end. I've got news for you, CZ. She is. You couldn't get much more of a polar opposite interpretation of what Carmela's doing and what she should actually do than this. And I know I've presented it in a slightly jaundiced way, but I hope you would also agree with me that I don't think this type of analysis would be difficult to find again and again and again online. I think this is more in line with the current zeitgeist than Dr. Krakower and me as a little Dr. Krakower groupie. But anyway, to start to bring this to a close, I thought it would be interesting to link all this to another one of my heroes, Jack Nicholson. And in A Few Good Men, I encourage you, it's not the best of films. It is Hollywood through and through. But it's basically a story about a Marine I'm trying to remember for the life of me. Santiago, I think his name is, who's a pretty useless Marine. And he gets ostracized within his corps. And what's called a code red is instigated. And a code red is unofficial. It's not done on any official channels, and there's no record of it. But the men within his corps discipline him because he's letting the corps down. So it's like an extrajudicial, extra-official punishment. And during this hazing, this code red, he dies. And the Jack Nicholson character is the general in charge. And it turns out he was the one who issued the code red. But I just find the dialogue in the court case really interesting. And I would say it's very Hollywood, because in opposition, the people arguing against Jack Nicholson in this court case is a legal team consisting of Tom Cruise and Demi Moore, which I'd suggest is probably, aesthetically not your standard military prosecution team. But it's brilliant casting in a way, because I just think Tom Cruise has an eminently punchable face. And he's so prissy. And he's the clean-faced voice of good, legal, military honour. And the Jack Nicholson character is basically playing the Joker in uniform. He represents everything he would argue that men need to do as soldiers, that whiter than white. And it's quite ironic. You think he's a Navy officer in the film. The Tom Cruise character walks around in whites all the time. And when they visit the base to do their initial investigation, he's wearing all white Navy uniform. And when he's taken, I think it's in a helicopter, they say you've got to change your uniform into fatigues, combat fatigues, because they're in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and the Cubans on the other side of the fence would know he's an officer and would likely shoot. So the whiter than white isn't practical in the most practical sense. He has to change his uniform. But all the way through the film, and especially at the end, he's the moral one. The Jack Nicholson character is presented as the evil, demonic, doing illicit things. And I just think the film, I referred to Netflix Adolescence as accidentally brilliant, despite its Hollywood kitschiness. A Few Good Men, I'm obviously not the demographic they were trying to appeal to, because I was much more on Jack Nicholson's side. Because on a philosophical basis, Jack Nicholson is drawing attention to what's unspoken normally. The code red stands for everything that goes on in our society that deep down we know is necessary, but we don't talk about. So extreme masculinity, toxic masculinity is an awful bad thing as it's presented in today's society. But at the same time, we know, it's the whole Tony Soprano subplot, we know in certain circumstances, and this is what I referred to in the previous video with reference to the Australian TV series Mr. In Between. That character, Ray Shoesmith, his constant refrain is that sometimes there is such thing as good violence. Men need to be violent to stop other men getting away. I was going to say getting away with murder, literally and metaphorically. But anyway, this is the dialogue from the court case. So, this is Kathy, who is the Tom Cruise character. Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red? And the judge, you don't have to answer that question. Colonel Jessup says, I'll answer the question. You want answers? Kathy, I think I'm entitled to them. You want answers? I want the truth. Pompous. You can't handle the truth. I'm on Team Jessup here. Son, and this is Jack Nicholson character continuing, son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? The helper. I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know. My existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honour, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather that you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand the post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you're entitled to. Kathy, did you order the code red? I did the job. Did you order the code red? You're goddamn right I did. And that's when, obviously, he's in trouble and he gets carted off, and the Tom Cruise character outdoes himself for whiter than white personal pomposity. But I wanted to tie this back into the Rieff. In Rieff's view, culture gives people a means of controlling the infinite variety of panic and emptiness to which they are disposed. In the form of books, music and love, for example, culture gives back bettered what is taken away by restraining impulse and curbing certain emotions, or at least limiting their expression. What infuses the interdictions with possibilities for well-being and gives people the motivation to accept limits on their desires and behaviours is some kind of transcendent referent, a collective commitment higher than the self that is deemed sacred. In the absence of such a framework of meaning, individuals have the appearance of being free, but in fact are awash in anxiety, disconnection, and disease. And I just think that's a brilliant that quote is a brilliant summary of this channel's rationale for all the things that art and literature provide that the therapeutic culture that Rieff criticises can't provide, because it's geared towards not giving us interdictions, thou shalt not. But as we saw in the examples I've given you, it's all about condoning whatever choices you make. You know, be the real you. And all this identity politics at the moment is premised upon children at school deciding they identify as badgers, and all this ridiculous levels of self-assertion in the absence of any higher order. And I just thought it was fascinating. That's what CZ picked up on in her analysis. Her resistance seemed to be the very notion of being judged by a higher order. And I just think it's interesting that Nietzsche in Thus Spake Zarathustra is a very, very difficult philosopher and very weird and esoteric. But his concept of the last man is describing Rieff's notion of the third world and what happens when you're in it. Alas, there comes the time of the most despicable man who can no longer despise himself. Lo, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asks the last man, and blinks. The earth hath then become small, and on it there hops the last man, who makes everything small. His species is ineradicable, like that of the ground flea. The last man lives longest. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. They have left the regions where it is hard to live, for they need warmth. One still loveth one's neighbour and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. I just think this is like a Mephistophelian image of Tony Soprano. And in some senses, remember that quote where he says, "I feel I've come at the end of things. It would have been good to be in at the beginning." So in that sense, Tony Soprano is the Nietzschean last man. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll leave you with one final image that I think eloquently, more eloquently than I could ever say with words, provides in the image form the type of mood I wake up in every single morning. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.